this session is to focus on how BRICS and G20 can work for Africa. But before I go into that, let's talk about BRICS a little bit. What's happening there? It's been in the news for a number of reasons. Expansion of BRICS, countries lining up to join BRICS, the contrast between BRICS and the G7. You've seen various headlines around these big issues. How are we today placed as BRICS? What is the role of BRICS? Are we the new or the aspirants for being the new G7? What is attracting so many countries to become part of BRICS? What are we offering them, right? So what is it that is so attractive about BRICS in your assessment? And then maybe if I can be a little naughty, are we going to expand the BRICS?
No, thank you. Thank you, Samir. Thank you, first of all, for having me on this platform. And I must congratulate ORF in having the Kigali dialogue. Any focus and attention on the African continent is welcome. And I know ORF has been very focused on Africa, and we appreciate that because very often Africa is marginalized and not part of the mainstream. So these kind of platforms provide us a very important meeting point of minds to look at Africa from various perspectives. Let me come to BRICS. You're correct, perhaps more so than in the past. BRICS is very much in the spotlight for perhaps the right reasons, and perhaps some see it for the wrong reasons. Let me say that BRICS has been now meeting. This year will be the 15th summit. And we met 2 weeks ago in Cape Town, the foreign ministers. And someone asked a question to the ministers about the relevance of BRICS, and is BRICS the new alternative paradigm to the G7? And Dr. Jaishankar reminded that BRICS has been around for 1.5 decades. It's not a new forum. 1.5 decades is not a long time, but it's fairly well established. Now, I'm very often asked the question, why sudden surge of interest in BRICS since last year? Of course, we started the conversation within BRICS about expansion, where the leaders at the Beijing summit, in fact, it was the foreign ministers first in May last year that started the conversation on expansion, and leaders then tasked Sherpas to look at the question of expansion, working out rules of procedure, criteria, standards, so forth. But we have seen at least formally, I think, over a dozen countries have written to BRICS leaders asking for membership, and at least another 15 or so wanting to become BRICS members. Very often I'm asked by my colleagues from in Pretoria, the European missions, why this sudden interest in BRICS? And I said, I think you know the answer to that question. I don't have to answer it. There's a sudden, as we discussed in the opening plenary yesterday, we lived in a very changed global environment, very uncertain global environment. And countries of the so-called global south, I saw your recent article about this term global south, but we still use it loosely, find within BRICS certain values and systems that we have been representing that they can align with and identify with. And therefore, I think in this uncertain world, countries, at least middle powers and LDCs, smaller countries, are looking for something to hold on to give them some sense of identification, security. And therefore, I think you have this surge of interest in BRICS from countries of the global south. We had one country from Europe also last week formally writing to become a BRICS member. So every part of the world we've got applications from to become a BRIC member. Expansion, whether it will happen at this summit, is still an ongoing process. There's still much more work to be done. But let me also point out, and I think yesterday's conversation was very helpful, that within the G20, 60% of the membership is G7 and BRICS. We are 12 countries out of the 19 countries, minus the EU as a regional body, that makes up the G20. And we work together in the G20, lots of synergies, lots of differences. And I think with you having, India having the chairship this year, provides us a platform. And I think the G20 is the staircase that joins the global north and the south. And I think you have been managing this process fairly well. And it's important that the chairs after you continue to build on this. BRICS, I don't think, sees itself as an alternative to the G7. We are not in competition with any entity, but what we would like to see is an alternative to the current global order. As was mentioned last night, we are in the process of evolving into a multipolar world. We're not there yet, but I think it's important that as a collective, and I want to recall the words of what Antonio Guterres said now at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, where he stated firstly that the UNSC and the Bretton Woods institution are outdated and they are in need of serious reform. In fact, he used 3 phrases to describe them. He said they are outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. And in the same interview, he also stated that the global north must do much more to address the concerns of the global south. Now, this is coming from the UNSC Secretary General, and I think he's carefully considered the phrases he used and carefully mentioned the frustrations, and I think he was being very diplomatic. I think it's more than frustration. The continued marginalization of the global south and especially Africa. So I think this is what countries see in BRICS as a voice championing a more equitable, inclusive, fair, just world order, but working in tandem with our other partners. BRICS is not anti-North, but many writers I see in recent times have been juxtaposing BRICS as being anti-North, being against G7. We are in competition with the G7. We need an inclusive world, as you said yesterday, and I think we can't build that just by ourselves as Africa or the global south. We must do so as a collective of humanity, and I think that's why your theme is so apt in terms of what we are trying to do. And we, as was also mentioned, we need to move away from competition and contestation towards cooperation. Last week, I was at the Astana International Forum. We also had a discussion. I was part of a panel on the future of multilateralism, and I reminded them of the very preamble of the UN Charter. The preamble calls on us to practice tolerance and to live in harmony with each other. Unfortunately, today, we have more intolerance than tolerance, and we have more disharmony than harmony in the world today. And yet this is the charter that's supposed to govern us, our organization, on how we should conduct ourselves. And I think we need to move back to the roots from where we started off in terms of creating a new global order.
I think those are, that's a very powerful opening intervention by you. I was actually more harsh on the UN. The SG was obviously defending his turf. Look, we have 3 European Security Council members, 3 out of 5. And yet they can't find peace in the continent. So clearly they are not doing the job. And you know, in some ways, how does a dynamic of a group impact its outcome is a good question to ask. For example, if you want to expand the BRICS, and I'm posing this as a genuine question, won't there be a fear that you are going to bring in folks and rather dilute the African agenda instead of strengthening it? Is there a worry that if BRICS has to work for Africa, does it work by adding more folks who will bring in their own specific needs and aspirations into the conversation? Or is that perfectly fine? That this is not necessarily an Africa-only project, and it's Africa with everyone project. So how will the new dynamic play out in terms of Africa being one of the key focus areas for the BRICS as it stands today, with China, India, South Africa, certainly 3, focusing heavily on that continent? So do you worry that it may distract from that?
Look, expansion is not an easy process. It's a difficult process. And therefore, as Sherpas, we've been having, as tasked by our political principles, to work out criteria and so forth. We've had about 5 meetings. And the report that I presented to the ministers 2 weeks ago on behalf of the Sherpas is that we have not found consensus yet. So that will give you an idea of the difficulties, precisely the question you have raised. We saw what happened to the EU when it moved from 15 to 25 to 28, and it started unraveling, and the challenges that came with the expansion. So we don't want to have expansion. We must be very sure, why do we want expansion? Do we need expansion? And what does expansion entails? And what many have indicated, we went on a public drive in South Africa, engaging with academia, civil society. We've had about 4 workshops, the business sector as well, to get their views on expansion, so that it's not just a government process. And one of the things that came out very clearly is that BRICS has established itself as a global brand. It's well known today, and it's well known as a voice of the global south. Now, if you bring in new members, we have to be careful that in this rush to become part of BRICS, some has indicated that it's a rush to create by the coalition of the wounded to become part of the BRICS family. So I think, therefore, it's very important that we must be very clear in terms of why we want to expand, how do we expand? Is it through full membership? Is it through some kind of alliance, some kind of partnership? All of these modalities have to be looked at because it can't dilute what we have built up and what we stand for and what we'd like to take forward. Because I think, what came out very clearly at the ministerial as well is that BRICS must show leadership. The world is in need of leadership at this juncture, this fractured world we are living in. And we are not getting that leadership from the global north, unfortunately, at the present time. And that's why the world is looking to the global south. And I think this is a moment. If we don't seize this moment and utilize it properly in terms of how we want to articulate the world, the way forward as BRICS, I think it'll be a very unfortunate and lost momentum if we don't do this. And I think that came out very clearly. It's a challenge for us, but how we respond is equally challenging. And I think with the current focus on BRICS and the summit in South Africa, unfortunately, we have a challenge. We have this warrant of arrest against President Putin by the ICC. And this presents a challenge. We are party to the Rome Statute, so we are bound to the ICC in terms of this warrant. But it's something that the South African government is dealing with at the present time. We're looking at our options. But it does, of course, bring sharper focus on the summit for the wrong reasons as well.
Correct.
For the wrong reasons.
But in some sense, I just wanted to change tack slightly and extend this conversation. If we go back to the early years, and I must confess that I was there in Moscow in 2008 when the seeds of this idea were being planted, and that led to the eventual first BRICS summit, BRIC at that time. So I've traveled a fair distance with this group. It's now nearly 15 years. But at that point of time, the mood of those who were seeking to build it was to oppose hegemony, was to oppose the unfair system, was to oppose what had happened in Iraq and what was about to happen in other parts of North Africa and the Middle East. It was to oppose the unilateral instincts that were defining that moment of global governance. And I asked this at the Cape Town Academic Forum, the think tank BTTC meeting, that if we were defined by that mood then, and we were willing to stand up to oppose an unfair system or unilateralism or the violation of territorial integrity, is it incumbent on the BRICS to also reflect and oppose if it happens from within? If that is the ethic, should it not be preserved even now? We have maybe a couple of countries in the group itself who need to be questioned.
Obviously, we need to do that. I mean, what we postulate for the rest of the world must apply to us first and foremost. If we don't do that, I think then we're on very shaky grounds. I think the very values and principles that brought BRICS together in 2008 and leading up to the first summit in 2009 are still relevant today as it was then. You would have seen even in last year's declaration, we spoke about respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, respect for the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and respect for international law. All of these were the founding principles of BRICS. That's echoed in the summit declaration of last year. It's echoed in the ministerial statement of 2 weeks ago. We can't deviate from that because that's what we set out to do in terms of creating a new global architecture. So it applies to us as well. Those of us within, it must. If it doesn't, then we have no business to start calling for a new global architecture.
Great. So, I'm going to at this stage invite you guys to join into this conversation. There are mics behind in the room on my right and on my left. You can walk to the mics and ask your questions. But till they walk to the mics and organize themselves, let me just ask you one more question. In terms of content, now I'm moving into the content area. As South Africa, what would be your top 3 priorities in terms of themes, outcomes that you seek out of this 1 year of leadership?
Well, always, Samir, whenever we hosted BRICS, it was also about the African continent. So you would have seen, again, we have carried that continuity, what we had in 2013, 2018, again now, partnership with Africa. It provides an opportunity for BRICS to interact with Africa, and we are specifically looking at the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and how BRICS can interact with that for mutual benefit. That's very, very important. Secondly, you would have seen that within the summit theme, there's a focus on sustainable development and accelerated growth. On both counts, we need to work much more. Of course, you would have seen the recent spring meetings in Washington, that we are in shaky grounds in terms of the global economy, but the major part of growth is going to be generated from Asia. And that, I think, is positive news, India and China being the fastest growing major economies. What can we do in terms of our cooperation to look at accelerated growth? And of course, the sustainable development goals. We have been set back tremendously, especially Africa. Close to 100 million people were pushed into poverty as a result of the pandemic, the major part of that in Africa. Millions of jobs have been lost, and we are off track. How can we work together in that? And finally, inclusive multilateralism. We have to address the issue of multilateral reform. It can't be in this day and age that you don't have Africa, Latin America represented. That's why the Security Council is semi-paralyzed. Some say it's on drips. It's rendered paralyzed in terms of.
But that's a longer conversation, because maybe even 2 of your BRICS members don't want inclusive reforms. So we have to cast the net wider if we need to move there. So let's take questions here. Can I ask a lady to come in front? I want you. Yeah, here. Why don't you come in front and pose the first question? And then we will bring in the others. Why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for such thought-provoking session. My name is Maria Harolska, Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Russian Academy of Science. I have a question. How do you assess, advantages, disadvantages, prospects of BRICS mechanism for trade in national currencies among members? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, can you pick up a few? I will remind you if I forget. Why don't we come to you?
My name is Dr.
Has Israel applied for BRICS membership yet? I'm just asking because I'm not keeping track. Okay. There's a mic coming behind you. Wait, there's a mic coming behind you.
Okay. My name is Chai Cohen from Tel Aviv University, Israel. I have 2 brief questions. You mentioned about the territorial integrity principle, the importance of that. So I would like to hear what you think about this Russian invasion in Ukraine, because as far as I understand BRICS, the R stands for Russia. So I want to hear what you can tell about that. And second issue is, maybe you can provide us perspective for India. As far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, but India is a member of Quad, which is an organization that was designed to contain China, which is the C in BRICS. So I would like to understand how you Indian decision makers are handling this contradictory picture.
No, I just want to clarify, Ambassador Anil Sooklal is the ambassador at large for South Africa. His name sounds Indian, okay. And we want him to be Indian, but he doesn't want to come to India.
Maybe then you can answer this question, if it's possible.
I will answer this question during tea time. Ambassador Sujan Chenoy will answer this question during tea time. Okay. But we'll keep your question to the first one.
Thank you.
I don't want, but we'll take one more then. Please go ahead.
So, Lukan Yunyer from South Africa. I'm very interested as you think about the expansion of BRICS. It's quite possible in its small nature now for South Africa to say it's interested in an African presidency and an African outlook. As you expand BRICS and becomes more dilutionary in practice, how do you then keep at least South Africa's role still at the center of how it plays out? I have multiple ways of phrasing it, but I think that's the easiest way of doing it.
Is South Africa ceding space to Africa? That's the basic question. I think that's what you asked. Okay, final question, Mr. Slot.
Thank you. I am Vishnu Preti from Nepal Center for Contemporary Research, Kathmandu. I am a geostrategic researcher. Thank you, Ambassador Sooklal. You give very positive perspective on the future of the BRICS. It seems quite encouraging to listen. But looking to many other dimensions, for example, the Russian invasion and India, China, some sort of the non-cooperation or even tension in one side, the other side, Indo-Pacific strategy, pushing the Quad group. So how you see that perspective within that context? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more. I'm keeping track. We'll take one more and then that's the final round. We can't take more after this. The clock is staring at me. Andre,
Thank you.
quickly introduce yourself and pose the question.
Thank you. So much pressure. Andre de Melo e Souza. I'm from the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. Thank you, Ambassador Sooklal, for the discussion on BRICS. I would actually like to know your views on the IBSA initiative, India, Brazil, South Africa, which I have always championed. And as much of the relevance of BRICS comes from having an economic superpower, China, a military superpower, Russia, perhaps, as we discussed yesterday, geopolitical imperatives override other issues, and we could be doing a lot more within our three countries, Brazil, India, and South Africa. So I'd like to hear your views on that as well. Thanks.
Great. I think you have an excellent set of questions. The first one from my Russian colleague on single currency trade.
Look, a few years ago, we signed the BRICS interbank mechanism to trade in local currency. So this is nothing new. What we are seeing is an acceleration of this agreement to trade in local currency. And this is not only amongst BRICS countries. You are seeing globally countries moving towards trade in local currencies. Even the NDB, in the new 5-year plan, they have indicated that at least 30% of borrowing will be in local currency. So this is what it is about, deepening trade, investment, borrowing in local currency, and even looking at a payment system in local currency. That's happening at an accelerated pace for reasons I think all are aware of. On the issue of the
Territorial integrity.
I think I answered that. South Africa's position was very clear when we issued a statement in terms of respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, but we know that the Russia-Ukraine war is far more than the Russia-Ukraine war, and therefore you see an initiative by African presidents, 6 of them going to Russia and Ukraine in the coming week to try and talk peace, because that's the only route we can move towards. No war has been won on the battlefield, and this is not going to be good news for all of us as long as this protracted war continues. So we must all talk peace, and I think even Prime Minister Modi said, now is not the time for war.
And do you want to take a shot at India and Quad?
Well, yeah. Look, yesterday it was very clear. We live in a gray area at the moment. There's multi-alignment, multiple interests, a multipolar world. There's no contradiction. India and Pakistan are part of SCO. We are part of BRICS. China is part of BRICS. China and India are part of SCO. So you will project your national interest and see where you can work together for common interest. You will do so. But that doesn't preclude you because you have some challenges with certain countries. I can't be part of this forum because you're selling yourself short, because you can obviously benefit if there are benefits in that forum.
And South Africa and the Africa dimension, are you diluting South Africa's role?
I don't think so. You see, there has been a call for the African Union to move from observer and be a permanent member of the G20. We're fully supportive of this because you have the European Union plus you have EU members in the G20. It doesn't dilute France's role or Germany's role in the G20. It amplifies it. So having a full member as the African Union only strengthens the hand of Africa.
And then, of course, our colleague from Nepal asked you the question that, what about the tensions within? And of course, the tensions around some of the members of the BRICS, India, China, one of them. In a sense, you've answered it, but...
You'll see much more of this. We live in an age of contestation, age of competition, age of conflict. And I've said that this decade is going to be characterized by greater competition, greater cooperation, greater contestation, and more conflict. That's coming. It's already with us. But we have to learn to maneuver and live with these kind of paradoxical situations that we find ourselves in, and try to see how best we advance our national interests, our regional interests, and our global interests.
And final question was on IPSA. How
Yeah.
can we celebrate that more robustly, make that into a movement, maybe in a few years, we should be in a position where there are 35 countries applying for membership of IPSA.
It's already there, Samir. You know, I was at the founding of IPSA in 2003.
I know, it's your baby.
And we have passed over the baton to India, has passed over the baton to Brazil. Brazil has a very ambitious plan of action for this year, including a summit later this year. And I think it's important that IPSA is revitalized and strengthened. We actually, for a while, we lost the game in terms of focusing just on BRICS. And the three of us, I think there's so much of synergy. The IPSA fund is globally recognized for what it does in terms of South-South cooperation. There's so much of value in strengthening and revitalizing IPSA, and I think we are working towards that.
Excellent. Ambassador Sooklal, I think we had a very comprehensive conversation. We covered a large range of issues. You have, I'm sure, also given food for thought to many of us in this room on some of your suggestions and ideas. I'm sure you will be, you will certainly not have a lunch, a peaceful lunch. You will have lots of people having conversations with you today on many of these questions. But let me take this opportunity to thank you for aligning with the Kigali Global Dialogue, making this part of your BRICS agenda, making us part of your presidency. And we are delighted this could happen. Let me also make a quick announcement to everyone that please watch out. Somewhere in the month of November, towards the later part of it, we plan to have a G20 and BRICS joint meeting in Cape Town. I have made the request to Ambassador Sooklal to, if that could be possible, as a way where we bring together the learnings from G20 and from the BRICS together, bring the past and the future presidencies in one room, and have a review of where we are and what we need to do. And even though he's not said yes, but he has shown excitement. And he's agreed. There you go. So that's the advantage of being at Kigali again. But, you know, thank you, Usta. Kigali is where we agree to now do a Cape Town summit, where we will have many of you in the room. So please watch out for that space. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Sooklal for his time and his effort in coming to Rwanda. Thank you very much.